I'm Caroline Roberts, 30 years old, a veteran who served 8 years and earned 3 Bronze Stars for combat deployments. For years, I gave everything: discipline, sacrifice, even my health, to a family that rarely listened and never seemed to believe in me. But when my own father testified in court that I was just a deadbeat, siding against me over my grandmother's estate, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been betrayed by the very person you spent your life trying to prove yourself to? If so, share your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground against family or fight for your worth, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about boundaries and resilience. What happened next might just surprise you. By October, I was fighting on multiple fronts: the legal case, the family pressure, and my own growing doubts about whether I was making a terrible mistake. The woman who'd coordinated complex military operations was struggling to handle a simple estate dispute. Maybe they were right. Maybe I really was too damaged, too unstable, too fundamentally broken to function in the civilian world. The courtroom where we finally faced off was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill. Judge Patricia Walsh presided from a bench that seemed too large for the mundane family dispute we were about to air. David sat with his lawyer at one table, looking confident in his tailored suit and polished shoes. I sat with Sarah at another, wearing my only interview outfit and feeling like a fraud in corporate drag. The proceeding began with David's attorney, a silver-haired man named Morrison, who spoke in the carefully modulated tones of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. He painted a picture of my life that was technically accurate, but emotionally devastating. Unemployed for 11 months. Living with parents at age 30. No permanent address, no steady income, no clear career trajectory. A history of impulsive decision-making that had led me to abandon conventional paths in favor of military service. "Your Honor," Morrison said, his voice carrying the weight of reasonable concern, "the petitioners are not questioning Miss Roberts' character or patriotism. They're simply concerned about her current life circumstances and whether she's in a position to make responsible financial decisions during this transitional period." Transitional period. As if my adult life was just a gap year that had stretched too long, a detour I needed to navigate before rejoining the real world where responsible people lived. Sarah fought back with facts and documentation. My military service record was exemplary. My financial management during deployment had been responsible. My savings account showed disciplined budgeting and careful planning. But the numbers seemed abstract against the concrete reality of my current circumstances: 30 years old and living in my childhood bedroom. Miss Roberts has demonstrated consistent financial responsibility throughout her military career, Sarah argued. Her current employment transition is temporary and should not be grounds for restricting her inheritance rights. Morrison smiled, the patient smile of someone who held all the cards. Counsel raises valid points about Miss Roberts' past financial management. However, we're concerned about her current judgment and decision-making capacity. Military service, while admirable, doesn't necessarily prepare someone for civilian financial management. There it was again. The subtle dismissal of my service as irrelevant training for real-world responsibilities. 8 years of managing budgets, personnel, and logistics under combat conditions, reduced to inadequate preparation for balancing a checkbook. The testimony began with David, who spoke in measured tones about his concerns for my welfare. He mentioned my struggles with civilian employment, my apparent difficulty adapting to post-military life, my tendency toward isolation, and what he called defensive responses to family input. He painted himself as the caring older brother who just wanted to protect his sister from her own poor judgment. "She's always been impulsive," he said, glancing at me with what looked like genuine concern. "Even as kids, she'd make dramatic gestures instead of thinking things through." The military thing was just the latest example. The military thing. My 8 years of service dismissed as a dramatic gesture, like dyeing my hair purple or joining a rock band. I felt Sarah's hand on my arm, a warning to stay calm, but my pulse was already accelerating to combat rhythm. Michelle's testimony followed the same script. She worried about my mental health, my social isolation, my apparent inability to commit to conventional life paths. She mentioned that I'd been different since coming home, more withdrawn and defensive. She suggested that my current living situation indicated an inability to function independently. "I love my sister," she said, her voice catching slightly. "But she seems lost right now. I don't think she's in a place to make major financial decisions." Lost. The word hit like a sniper's bullet, precise and devastating. I'd been many things during my military service: exhausted, scared, angry, determined, but never lost. I'd always known exactly where I was and what I was supposed to do. But here, in this airless courtroom, listening to my family describe me as a dysfunctional charity case, I felt completely adrift. Then came the moment that changed everything. Dad took the witness stand with the same calm confidence he brought to everything. He wore his best suit, the navy blue one he reserved for weddings and funerals, and his silver hair was perfectly combed. He looked like a man you'd trust to manage your finances, give you life advice, make reasonable decisions in complicated situations. Morrison began with routine questions about my childhood, my character, my relationship with my grandmother. Dad answered thoughtfully, presenting himself as a concerned father who wanted what was best for his daughter. He spoke about my impulsiveness, my tendency to make decisions without fully considering consequences, my apparent struggle to adapt to civilian life after my military phase. Military phase. As if Bronze Stars were something you earned during a particularly intense semester abroad. "In your opinion, Mr. Roberts," Morrison asked, "is your daughter currently in a position to manage a significant inheritance responsibly?" Dad paused, looking directly at me with what appeared to be genuine sadness. "I love my daughter very much," he said. "But honestly, she's been struggling since she got back from overseas. She can't hold a job, can't maintain stable housing, can't seem to figure out what direction she wants her life to take. She's 30 years old and living in her childhood bedroom." The words landed like artillery shells, each one precisely targeted to cause maximum damage. I felt Sarah tense beside me, but there was nothing we could do except let him finish destroying my credibility. "She's always been headstrong," Dad continued. "Always convinced she knew better than everyone else. That's what led her to join the military in the first place, against our advice. And now she's fighting us again instead of accepting help from people who care about her." He paused, adjusting his tie with the same careful precision he brought to everything. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of paternal disappointment. "The truth is, Your Honor, she's just a deadbeat. She's never held a real job, never built anything permanent, never taken responsibility for her own life. She spent 8 years playing soldier, and now she expects the world to reward her for it." Playing soldier. Deadbeat. The words hung in the courtroom air like smoke from a house fire, acrid and choking. I felt something fundamental break inside me, not just my heart but my understanding of who I was in the world. This was my father, the man whose approval I'd spent 30 years chasing, reducing my service to a game and my character to worthlessness. In front of a judge, in front of lawyers, in front of my siblings who nodded along as if he'd simply stated obvious truth. The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I could hear the courtroom's air conditioning cycling, the scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her machine, the distant sound of traffic outside windows I couldn't see. Sarah's hand found my forearm, her grip tight enough to anchor me to my chair when everything else felt like it was dissolving. Judge Walsh leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Roberts," she said, her voice neutral, "you're testifying that your daughter is financially irresponsible based on her military service and current employment status?" "Yes, Your Honor," Dad said without hesitation. "She's never learned how the real world works. Never had to make a mortgage payment or manage a real budget or deal with civilian workplace politics. She's lived in this fantasy world where everything's provided for you, and now she doesn't know how to function independently." Fantasy world. As if Kandahar had been summer camp with live ammunition. As if managing logistics under enemy fire was somehow easier than balancing a household budget. as if leading soldiers through combat operations required less judgment than choosing a 401k plan. I see, Judge Walsh said. She picked up a file folder from her desk, the same beige folder that had been sitting there throughout the proceedings. I'd assumed it contained standard estate paperwork, routine documentation of assets, and legal requirements. But as she opened it and began reading, I realized I'd been wrong. Mr. Roberts, the judge said, not looking up from the folder, I have your daughter's military service record here. It indicates she served 8 years on active duty, including 3 combat deployments to Afghanistan. Yes, Your Honor, but it also shows she received numerous commendations for her service, including 3 Bronze Stars for valor. Judge Walsh looked up from the file, her expression still neutral, but her voice carrying a different weight. Are you familiar with the requirements for earning a Bronze Star, Mr. Roberts? Dad's confident expression flickered, like a television screen with bad reception. Well, I know it's some kind of military award, but the Bronze Star is awarded for heroic or meritorious achievement in connection with military operations against an armed enemy, Judge Walsh said, reading directly from the file. The citation requirements specified that recipients must demonstrate courage under fire and exceptional leadership in combat situations. She closed the file and looked directly at my father. Your daughter didn't earn 3 Bronze Stars by playing soldier, Mr. Roberts. She earned them by risking her life to save others. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. David's confident smile had evaporated. Michelle was staring at her hands. Morrison looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. And Dad looked like someone had just told him the sun rises in the west. Furthermore, Judge Walsh continued, her service record indicates she managed multi-million-dollar budgets, supervised personnel ranging from 10 to 40 soldiers, and coordinated complex logistics operations under combat conditions. These are not the accomplishments of someone who lacks responsibility or judgment. She opened another folder, this one containing what looked like financial documents. I also have her banking records, provided by her attorney. They show 8 years of consistent savings, responsible spending, and careful financial planning. Her current unemployment appears to be the result of a difficult job market for veterans, not financial irresponsibility. The silence was deafening. Dad sat in the witness chair looking like he'd been hit by friendly fire, confused and hurt, and completely unprepared for this reversal. All his confident assertions about my incompetence were crumbling under the weight of documented evidence he'd apparently never bothered to review. Based on this evidence, Judge Walsh said, I find no grounds for restricting Miss Roberts' inheritance rights. The petitioner's concerns about her financial responsibility appear to be based on misunderstanding rather than fact. She looked directly at David and Michelle, her expression stern. Your sister is a decorated combat veteran with a demonstrable record of responsible decision-making under extreme pressure. Her current employment transition does not constitute grounds for treating her as financially incompetent. The gavel came down with a sound like gunfire. Case dismissed. Inheritance awarded according to the original will terms. Legal fees to be paid by the petitioners who had initiated the frivolous challenge. But the victory felt hollow as I watched my father struggle to process what had just happened. For 30 years, he'd seen me as the impulsive child who needed guidance and correction. The responsible father helping his wayward daughter make better choices. Now, suddenly, he was learning that the woman he'd dismissed as a deadbeat was actually a decorated hero whose judgment had been tested in ways he could barely imagine. The aftermath unfolded in slow motion. David tried to approach me as we left the courtroom, his face flushed with embarrassment. I had no idea about the Bronze Stars, he said. You never really talked about what you did over there. I looked at him for a long moment, this brother who'd been so confident about my incompetence an hour earlier. You never asked, I said quietly. Michelle was crying in the hallway, her husband hovering nearby looking uncomfortable. I'm sorry, she kept saying. I didn't know. Nobody told us about the medals. But they were there when I came home. They were there when I tried to share my experiences, when I attempted to explain what my service had meant. They'd chosen not to listen, not to ask, not to see anything beyond their preconceptions about military service being a detour from real life. Dad stood apart from the family group, leaning against a courthouse wall and staring at nothing. When I approached him, he looked up with an expression I'd never seen before, uncertainty mixed with something that might have been shame. "I didn't know," he said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. "About the Bronze Stars. About what you really did over there." "You could have asked," I said. "I tried to tell you." He nodded slowly, like a man waking up from a long dream. I thought it was just regular military service. I didn't realize you were." "What? A real soldier? Someone who actually did something that mattered?" He flinched at the edge in my voice, but didn't argue. For the first time in my life, my father had no ready explanation, no confident assessment of my failures, no advice about what I should do differently. He just stood there looking lost, trying to reconcile the deadbeat daughter he'd testified against with the decorated veteran the judge had described. "I was trying to help," he said finally. "I thought you needed guidance." "I needed support," I said. "I needed someone to believe in me." We stood there in the courthouse hallway, surrounded by the echoes of legal proceedings and family drama, both of us trying to figure out what came next. 30 years of our relationship had just been redefined by a judge with a manila folder and 5 minutes of reading military service records. The father-daughter dynamic we'd both taken for granted had been revealed as built on fundamentally false assumptions. I left him there and walked out into the Arizona sunshine, feeling lighter than I had in months, but also strangely empty. The validation felt good, but it couldn't undo the damage that had been done. The man whose approval I'd chased my entire life had just publicly called me a deadbeat, and no judge's ruling could erase that moment or the years of dismissal that had led to it. The days following the court hearing felt like navigating through emotional shrapnel. Word of the case and its outcome spread through our extended family network with the speed of gossip and the persistence of wildfire. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know about my Bronze Stars, my combat service, the heroic actions that had somehow been invisible to them for over a year. Aunt Linda called to apologize for her previous comments about my need to settle down. Uncle Ray, who'd served briefly in Vietnam, wanted to swap war stories he'd never bothered asking about before. Cousins who'd treated my military service as a curiosity now spoke about it with hushed reverence, as if Judge Walsh's words had somehow transformed me from family disappointment to family hero overnight. The attention felt hollow. These were the same people who'd watched Dad dismiss my service for months without a single objection. They'd nodded along when he described my military years as a phase, my unemployment as evidence of incompetence, my Bronze Stars as irrelevant trinkets. Now they wanted to claim reflected glory from accomplishments they'd helped diminish. "I always knew you were special," Aunt Linda said during one particularly grating phone call. "I remember telling your father that military service would be good for you." I remembered those conversations differently. I remembered her asking when I was going to get a real job, when I was planning to start a family, whether I thought I was too good for civilian work. But rewriting history seemed to be the family specialty. The hardest part was dealing with David and Michelle, who'd gone from confident opponents to bewildered siblings trying to process their complete misunderstanding of who I was. David called repeatedly, leaving voicemails that mixed genuine remorse with frustrated confusion. "Why didn't you ever talk about the medals?" he asked in one message. "We had no idea what you'd really done over there." But I had tried to talk about it. Not the classified details, not the specific operations that couldn't be shared, but the general experience of leading soldiers through combat, making life-and-death decisions, earning recognition for courage under fire. Every attempt had been met with polite disinterest or gentle redirection toward more practical concerns about my post-military career plans. Michelle's approach was different, more emotional, laden with the kind of dramatic regret that made me question whether she was genuinely sorry or just sorry she'd been caught on the wrong side of the narrative. She showed up at my parents' house one evening, her eyes red from crying, clutching a printout of Bronze Star medal requirements she'd found online. "I had no idea," she said, sitting across from me in the living room where we'd played as children. "These citations, they say you saved people's lives. You were shot at. You could have died." "Yes," I said simply. "That's what combat means. But you never told us it was like that. You always made it sound so routine." I'd tried to spare them the details, partly for security reasons and partly because I'd learned that most people didn't really want to hear about the ugliness of war. They preferred sanitized versions, heroic narratives without the complexity of moral ambiguity, the weight of decisions that haunted you years later, the way courage and terror could coexist in the same moment. "You never asked," I said, repeating what had become my standard response to family members who suddenly wanted to understand what they'd ignored for over a year. Michelle's tears came harder then, the kind of crying that seemed designed to make me comfort her rather than process my own feelings about what had happened. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I feel terrible about the court case. I was just trying to help." Helping. Everyone had been trying to help, apparently. David was helping by questioning my competence. Michelle was helping by supporting his concerns. Dad was helping by calling me a deadbeat in open court. The helping had nearly cost me my inheritance and definitely cost me any remaining illusions about my family's faith in my judgment. The dynamic with Mom was the most complicated of all. She'd stayed officially neutral during the legal proceedings, but I'd sensed her quiet agreement with Dad's assessment of my situation. Now she seemed caught between guilt about not defending me and confusion about how she'd so thoroughly misunderstood my military service. "Your father feels terrible," she said one morning over coffee, as if his feelings were the primary concern. "He had no idea about your medals. He's always been so proud of your service." Proud. The word felt meaningless after months of being treated like a family embarrassment. If he'd been proud, he'd hidden it remarkably well. If he'd respected my service, he'd managed to keep that respect completely separate from every conversation we'd had about my post-military life. "He called me a deadbeat in court, Mom. In front of a judge. In front of everyone." She fidgeted with her coffee cup, unable to meet my eyes. "He was just concerned about your future. He didn't mean it the way it sounded. But he had meant it exactly the way it sounded. That was the problem." In his mind, I really was a deadbeat, someone who'd avoided real responsibility by hiding in the military, someone who couldn't be trusted with adult decisions. The Bronze Stars didn't change that fundamental assessment, they just made it harder for him to express it publicly. The person I was most angry with, I realized, wasn't Dad or David or Michelle. It was myself. For believing them, even partially. For allowing their narrative about my incompetence to take root in my own mind. For spending months questioning my own worth instead of standing firm in the knowledge of what I'd accomplished and who I'd become. I'd survived 3 combat deployments, earned recognition for extraordinary courage, and led soldiers through situations that would break most people. But I'd let a suburban insurance salesman convince me I was a failure because I couldn't navigate the civilian job market with the same confidence I'd brought to leading patrols through hostile territory. The shame I felt wasn't about my military service or my current circumstances. It was about forgetting who I was, about letting other people's limited understanding become my self-perception. I'd allowed the opinion of someone who'd never faced anything more challenging than a difficult client to override my own knowledge of my capabilities and worth. 2 weeks after the court hearing, I made a decision that felt like returning to myself after a long deployment in enemy territory. I applied for jobs with defense contractors, companies that understood military experience and valued combat leadership. I reached out to my network of fellow veterans, people who knew what Bronze Stars meant and why they mattered. I started the process of moving out of my childhood bedroom and into an apartment of my own. The responses came quickly. 3 interviews in the first week, 2 job offers by the end of the month. Suddenly, I was valuable again, sought after, respected for the exact same experience my family had dismissed as irrelevant. The disconnect was jarring but instructive. The problem hadn't been my qualifications or my judgment. The problem had been trying to prove my worth to people who didn't understand what they were evaluating. Dad made several attempts to repair our relationship, awkward conversations where he tried to apologize without fully acknowledging what he'd done wrong. He wanted credit for raising a daughter who'd become a decorated veteran, but he also wanted to maintain that his concerns about my civilian transition had been reasonable given the information he'd had. "I'm proud of your service," he said during one particularly painful conversation. "I just wish you'd told me more about what you'd accomplished over there." But I had told him. Not in military jargon or formal citations, but in the language of someone trying to share meaningful experiences with family who cared enough to listen. He'd chosen not to hear it, just as he'd chosen not to ask follow-up questions or research what Bronze Stars represented or consider that someone who'd led soldiers through combat might have developed useful leadership skills. The relationship was damaged in ways that wouldn't be fixed by simple apologies or expressions of belated pride. Trust, once broken by public humiliation and systematic dismissal, couldn't be rebuilt through good intentions and awkward conversations. Some wounds heal with time and care. Others leave permanent scars that change how you move through the world. The question that haunted me wasn't whether Dad would eventually understand what he'd done wrong. It was whether I could ever trust his judgment about anything important again. When someone demonstrates that they're willing to publicly humiliate you based on assumptions they've never bothered to verify, when they reduce your life's most meaningful accomplishments to a phase, when they testify against you in court without doing basic research about your actual record of service, what does that tell you about their capacity for wisdom, fairness, or love? I'd spent 30 years believing that his approval mattered because his judgment was sound. Now I had to confront the possibility that his judgment had always been flawed, and I'd wasted decades chasing validation from someone whose opinions weren't worth having. The months that followed the court hearing became a careful experiment in rebuilding my sense of self outside the framework of family approval. I took a position with a defense contractor in Northern Virginia, managing logistics for overseas operations. The work was challenging and meaningful, drawing directly on skills I developed during my military service. My Bronze Stars weren't curiosities in this environment, they were credentials that opened doors and earned immediate respect. My new colleagues were mostly veterans themselves, people who understood the weight of combat experience without needing detailed explanations. They knew what it meant to make decisions under fire, to be responsible for other people's lives, to carry the knowledge of how quickly everything could go wrong. Conversations flowed in shorthand references to shared experiences, professional vocabulary that civilians often found off-putting, but that felt like coming home to me. For the first time since leaving the Army, I felt competent again. Not just employed, but genuinely good at what I was doing. My military experience wasn't a detour from real life. It was the foundation for everything I was building now. The skills I'd developed leading soldiers through hostile territory translated perfectly to managing complex projects under deadline pressure. The judgment I'd exercised coordinating with local officials in Afghanistan served me well in navigating corporate politics and client relationships. Within 6 months, I'd earned a promotion and a substantial raise. My supervisor, a former Marine colonel named Patricia Hayes, became something of a mentor, helping me translate military leadership principles into civilian management strategies. The conversations we had about command responsibility and decision-making under pressure felt like advanced coursework after years of being lectured about basic life skills by people who'd never faced anything more stressful than traffic jams. The hardest part about transitioning, Patricia told me during one of our regular coffee meetings, isn't learning civilian workplace culture. It's learning to value yourself appropriately after spending time around people who don't understand what you've accomplished. She was right. The civilian world was full of people like my family, well-meaning individuals who simply lacked the context to evaluate military service accurately. They knew it was supposed to be respected, but they didn't know why or how. They confused uniformed service with mindless obedience, combat leadership with following orders, decorated valor with participation trophy culture. The geographic distance from Phoenix helped enormously. Phone calls with family became less frequent and more superficial. Holiday visits were brief and carefully managed to avoid extended conversations about my work or personal life. I was polite, present, but no longer emotionally invested in their understanding or approval. Dad made periodic attempts to bridge the gap between us, sending articles about veteran employment issues or mentioning other military families he'd met. His efforts felt forced, like homework assignments from someone who'd realized he needed to show more interest, but didn't know how to generate genuine curiosity about experiences so far outside his own life. During one particularly awkward phone call, he mentioned meeting another veteran at his golf club. "Nice guy," Dad said. "Served in Iraq." Says the transition to civilian work was tough for him too. The implication was clear. See, it's not just you. Other veterans struggle with civilian life too. But what he'd meant as reassurance felt like another failure to understand. The veteran he'd met had probably struggled with unsympathetic employers, inadequate support systems, cultural disconnects between military and civilian environments. He hadn't struggled because his own father called him a deadbeat in open court. "That's nice, Dad," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Maybe you could connect with him sometime," he suggested. "Might be helpful to talk with someone who understands." Someone who understands. As if the problem was my need for understanding rather than his failure to provide it. As if talking to another veteran would somehow heal the damage he'd done by publicly dismissing my service as playing soldier. "I have plenty of veteran friends here," I said. "People I work with." "Right, of course. I just thought." His voice trailed off, uncertain how to finish the thought. What he'd thought, I realized, was that my anger was a phase I'd eventually outgrow, a temporary reaction that would fade once I got my life together. He was waiting for me to return to the dynamic we'd always had, where I sought his approval and he distributed wisdom about how I could do better. But that dynamic had been built on his assumption that his judgment was superior to mine, and the court hearing had shattered that assumption permanently. I wasn't angry anymore, exactly. Anger requires emotional investment, and I'd withdrawn mine. What I felt was something cooler and more permanent: indifference. His approval no longer mattered because his judgment no longer carried weight with me. The man who'd called me a deadbeat without bothering to learn what Bronze Stars meant wasn't someone whose opinions I needed to care about. The turning point came during a family gathering the following Christmas. I'd flown back to Phoenix for a brief visit, staying in a hotel rather than my childhood bedroom. The family dinner was tense with everyone's awareness of the previous year's court case, conversations carefully steered away from anything that might reference my military service or current success. Dad tried several times to engage me in discussions about my work, asking vague questions about the defense industry and veteran employment trends. His efforts felt performative, like someone who'd read an article about connecting with military children and was trying to implement the advice. "How's the new job going?" he asked during dessert. "Very well," I said. "I was promoted to program manager last month." "That's wonderful," he said with the kind of enthusiasm people use when they don't understand what they're celebrating. Program manager sounds important. It was important. I was managing a $50 million logistics contract with responsibility for coordinating operations across 3 time zones. But explaining the scope of my work would require him to understand that military experience was valuable, that leadership under pressure was a transferable skill, that Bronze Stars represented real accomplishments rather than consolation prizes. "It keeps me busy," I said instead. The conversation died there, killed by the gap between what I'd accomplished and what he was capable of recognizing. Later, as I was preparing to leave, he pulled me aside for one of those father-daughter talks that had defined our relationship for 30 years. "I know I made some mistakes last year," he said, his voice carrying the careful weight of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. "I should have asked more questions about your service. I should have understood better what you'd been through." Should have. Past tense, as if the problem was historical rather than ongoing. As if understanding my service record would fix the fundamental issue of his willingness to make judgments without information, to testify against me without investigation, to reduce my life's work to a dismissive phrase. "Yes," I said. "You should have." He waited for more, for forgiveness or reassurance that we could rebuild what had been broken. When I didn't provide it, he shifted uncomfortably and tried a different approach. "I hope you know I love you," he said. "I've always been proud of you. Always proud. Except when he'd called me a deadbeat. Except when he'd testified that I was financially irresponsible. Except when he'd dismissed my military service as playing soldier. Except when he'd spent months undermining my confidence and questioning my judgment." "I know you love me, Dad," I said. "But love isn't the same as respect." The words hung in the desert air between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to fully examine. He loved the idea of me, the daughter he'd tried to shape into his vision of success. But he'd never respected the woman I'd actually become, the choices I'd made, the person I'd proven myself to be through trial by fire. I left Phoenix the next morning with the understanding that our relationship would never return to what it had been. The dynamic was permanently altered, not just by what had happened in court, but by what the court case had revealed about the foundation we'd been building on all these years. Some changes can't be undone, and some insights can't be forgotten. 5 years have passed since Judge Walsh read my service record aloud in that courthouse. 5 years of building a life that doesn't require anyone else's validation to sustain it. The defense contractor position led to senior management roles, then to consulting work that draws directly on my combat experience. I've testified before congressional committees about veteran employment issues, spoken at conferences about military leadership principles, and been profiled in industry publications as an example of successful military-to-civilian transition. The Bronze Stars sit on my office bookshelf now, properly displayed in a shadow box with my other decorations. They're not hidden in tissue paper anymore, not treated like shameful secrets or irrelevant trinkets. They represent specific moments when I kept people alive through courage and judgment, decisions made under fire that proved my capacity for leadership under the worst possible circumstances. Colleagues and clients know about my military background because it's relevant to my expertise, not because I need to justify my competence to skeptics. The respect comes naturally from people who understand what Bronze Stars represent, who value combat experience as preparation for complex decision-making, who see military service as advanced leadership training rather than a detour from real life. My personal relationships have evolved along similar lines. I date other veterans primarily, people who understand the weight of service without needing detailed explanations. Friendships are built with individuals who see my military experience as an asset rather than a curiosity, who don't need convincing that Bronze Stars represent real accomplishments worth respecting. The apartment I live in isn't spectacular, but it's mine. No childhood bedroom, no family dynamics, no need to navigate approval from people whose judgment I no longer trust. The walls hold photos from deployments, certificates from professional accomplishments, evidence of a life built on my own terms according to my own values. Contact with family has settled into a sustainable rhythm of polite distance. Birthday cards and holiday calls, brief visits that avoid controversial topics, relationships maintained at the level of courtesy rather than intimacy. David and Michelle have largely given up trying to repair what was broken, accepting that I've moved beyond their orbit into a life they don't fully understand but can't dismiss anymore. Dad still calls occasionally, usually with updates about family news or questions about my work that demonstrate his ongoing effort to engage with my choices. The conversations are cordial but superficial, limited by the understanding that deeper connection would require him to fully acknowledge what he'd done and who he'd revealed himself to be. Some apologies are too fundamental to accept without transforming the entire relationship, and neither of us seems willing to undertake that level of emotional reconstruction. Your father asks about you all the time, Mom mentioned during a recent call. He's very proud of how well you're doing. Proud now when my success is visible and undeniable. Proud when magazine articles describe my expertise and congressional testimony validates my knowledge. Proud when the evidence is overwhelming enough that even he can't dismiss it as irrelevant or temporary. But I remember when he wasn't proud, when he called me a deadbeat in open court without bothering to verify the facts. I remember the months of systematic undermining, the casual dismissal of my service, the willingness to testify against me based on assumptions rather than evidence. Success doesn't erase those memories or restore trust that was broken so completely. The most profound change has been internal, in my relationship with my own sense of worth. For 30 years, I'd measured my value through other people's recognition, particularly his. My accomplishments mattered only if they impressed the right audience, if they earned approval from someone whose opinion I'd been taught to value above my own judgment. Now I know what I've done and what it means, independent of anyone else's understanding or acknowledgement. I've saved lives under fire and earned recognition for extraordinary courage. I've led people through situations that test character at the deepest level. I've proven my competence and judgment in ways that matter more than civilian metrics of success, like marriage timing or mortgage payments. The Bronze Stars represent moments of pure moral clarity, Split seconds when everything else fell away except the need to act with courage and wisdom. Those moments define who I am at my core, regardless of how others choose to interpret or dismiss my service. They're not subject to revision by people who weren't there, who don't understand what they cost, who can't imagine the weight of decisions made under enemy fire. Sometimes I wonder if Dad truly understands what he destroyed that day in court, whether he grasps the permanence of calling your own daughter a deadbeat in public testimony. I think he believes the damage was temporary, something that could be fixed with time and good intentions. But some words can't be taken back, and some insights about character can't be forgotten. He revealed something fundamental about himself when he testified against me without basic research, when he reduced my service to playing soldier, when he dismissed Bronze Stars as irrelevant to real-world competence. He showed me that his judgment was based on prejudice rather than evidence, that his love was conditional on conformity to his narrow vision of success, that his respect had to be earned through achievements he personally valued rather than objective measures of courage and accomplishment. That revelation was devastating initially, but ultimately liberating. I stopped seeking approval from someone whose approval wasn't worth having. I stopped trying to prove my worth to someone incapable of recognizing it. I stopped allowing his limited understanding to define my sense of self or constrain my possibilities. The woman who walked out of that courthouse 5 years ago was different from the one who'd walked in that morning. Not because Judge Walsh had validated my service record, but because I'd finally seen clearly who I was dealing with and what kind of relationship I'd been trying to maintain. Some illusions, once shattered, reveal reality that's simultaneously harsher and more empowering than what came before. I don't need his pride anymore. I have my own sense of accomplishment, built on actual achievements rather than other people's recognition. I don't need his approval anymore. I have the respect of colleagues who understand what Bronze Stars represent. I don't need his understanding anymore. I know who I am and what I've done, independent of his capacity to comprehend it. The deadbeat he testified against was never real, just a fiction created by his inability to see past his own assumptions about military service and civilian success. The decorated veteran who earned Bronze Stars for courage under fire was always real, even when he couldn't recognize her. Judge Walsh didn't transform me that day in court. She simply revealed what had been there all along, waiting for someone with the wisdom to see it clearly. That's the lesson that matters most. Your worth isn't determined by other people's recognition, but by what you've actually done and who you've actually become. Some people will never be capable of seeing your value, regardless of how much evidence you provide. The solution isn't to diminish yourself to their level of understanding, but to find people who can appreciate the full scope of what you've accomplished. The Bronze Stars shine just as brightly whether anyone else knows what they represent. The courage they commemorate remains constant whether anyone else acknowledges it. The person who earned them through extraordinary service is the same person who built a successful civilian career afterward, who testified before Congress, who earned the respect of colleagues and clients and friends who understand what real accomplishment looks like. I am not a deadbeat. I never was. And anyone who thinks otherwise simply doesn't have the judgment to evaluate what they're looking at. I learned early that my father's approval was currency I could never quite earn, no matter how much I saved up. Growing up in our split-level house in suburban Phoenix, I watched him distribute praise like a miser counting coins. My older brother got nods for decent grades. My younger sister earned smiles for being pretty and agreeable. I got lectures about trying harder, doing better, reaching higher. The bar always seemed to float just above my fingertips. At 12, I brought home straight A's and a certificate for winning the school science fair. Dad glanced at the paper while reading his evening news. "Good," he said, not looking up. "Now keep it up." My brother had gotten ice cream for a B+ in math the week before. That night, I stared at my bedroom ceiling and made a promise to myself. I would become someone he couldn't ignore. High school brought ROTC, where I discovered I had a talent for leadership that surprised everyone, including myself. I organized fundraisers, led drill competitions, earned every ribbon available. Colonel Martinez, our instructor, pulled me aside senior year. "You've got what it takes for the academy," he said. "Real officer material." I floated home on air, ready to share the news. Dad was in his garage, tinkering with his Buick's engine. Military, he said when I told him. That's just government work. No real future in it. He wiped his hands on a rag, not meeting my eyes. Besides, girls who go into the service, well, people talk. I enlisted anyway the day after graduation, choosing infantry because it was the hardest thing I could think of. If I was going to prove myself, I wouldn't take the easy path. Basic training at Fort Benning broke down plenty of recruits who thought they were tough. I thrived. The drill sergeant's insults bounced off me like rubber bullets. I'd heard worse at my own dinner table, delivered with less honesty and more psychological precision. My first deployment came 2 years later to Afghanistan's Kinnar province, where the mountains seemed to scrape holes in the sky. We ran patrols through valleys where every rock could hide an IED, every friendly wave might precede gunfire. I learned to trust my instincts, to make decisions when seconds mattered more than certainty. When Sergeant Rodriguez caught shrapnel from a roadside bomb, I dragged him 200 meters to the evacuation point while taking fire from 3 directions. The Bronze Star citation later called it conspicuous gallantry under enemy fire. I called it Tuesday. The second Bronze Star came during my 3rd tour, when our convoy hit an ambush outside Kandahar. The lead vehicle flipped, trapping 2 soldiers inside while insurgents poured automatic fire from the ridgeline above. I coordinated the counterattack while organizing the rescue, moving between positions under heavy fire to direct our response. We got everyone out alive and neutralized the threat. The medal felt heavier than the first one, weighted with the knowledge that split-second decisions had kept my people breathing. My final Bronze Star was earned not in a single moment of heroism, but through months of building relationships with village elders in Helmand Province, slowly earning trust that let us identify and neutralize cells planning attacks on civilian targets. Intelligence work doesn't make for dramatic stories, but it saves lives in ways that never make headlines. The citation mentioned my sustained courage in building critical human intelligence networks in hostile territory. What it didn't mention was the constant danger of trusting the wrong person, the sleepless nights wondering if today's ally would become tomorrow's informant. Between deployments, I called home regularly, sharing what I could about my service. Dad's responses were predictably lukewarm. When I told him about making sergeant, he said, "That's nice, honey. Your cousin Janet just got promoted to manager at the bank." When I mentioned the first Bronze Star, he seemed more interested in whether I was eating enough vegetables. The medal itself sat in a drawer at my base quarters, too precious and too painful to display. I served 8 years total, leading soldiers through some of the toughest terrain and situations the Army could offer. My final evaluation included words like natural leader, exceptional under pressure, and recommended for immediate promotion. I had job offers from 3 different defense contractors and an invitation to apply for Special Forces training. Instead, I chose to come home, thinking that surely now, with a record of service and sacrifice behind me, my father would finally see who I had become. The homecoming party was small, held in my parents' backyard on an October afternoon when the Arizona heat was finally breaking. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and polite questions about my time overseas. Dad manned the grill, flipping burgers with the same methodical precision he brought to everything. When Mrs. Henderson from next door asked about my service, he shrugged. "She was in the military for a while," he said, not looking at me. "Now she needs to figure out what she wants to do with her life." I watched him through the sliding glass door, wearing his favorite Cardinals cap and his weekend jeans, looking every inch the suburban dad who'd worked the same job for 25 years. He had never spent a night wondering if he'd see sunrise. He had never held a dying soldier's hand or made decisions that meant the difference between his people coming home or coming home in boxes. He had never earned the right to reduce my service to a while. That night, after the last neighbor left and the paper plates were thrown away, we sat on the back patio under the string lights my mother had hung years ago. The silence stretched between us like desert highway, long and empty and leading nowhere I wanted to go. I tried to find words that would bridge the gap, some way to explain what I'd experienced, what I'd accomplished, what I'd become. Instead, I watched him scroll through his phone, checking baseball scores, already moving past the moment I'd been building toward for 8 years. "Dad," I said finally. "I won 3 Bronze Stars." He looked up from his phone, squinting slightly in the patio light. "That's nice, sweetheart," he said. "Your mother wants to know if you're planning to stay in Phoenix or if you'll be moving on." Moving on. As if the last 8 years had been a detour, a gap year that had stretched too long. As if the woman who came home was the same girl who had left, just with a few stories to tell and a need to get serious about real life. I went to bed that night in my childhood room, surrounded by high school trophies and faded photos of friends who'd married and started families while I was learning to lead soldiers through minefields. My Bronze Stars were in my duffel bag, wrapped in tissue paper like Christmas ornaments too fragile for display. In the darkness, I finally understood that no amount of service, no number of medals, no level of achievement would ever be enough to earn what I'd spent my entire life trying to win. The approval I craved wasn't currency after all. It was fool's gold, shiny and worthless, and I'd been mining for it in the wrong mountain all along. The transition back to civilian life proved harder than any deployment. At least in Afghanistan, I knew who the enemy was. Back in Phoenix, I faced a more insidious opponent, my father's expanding catalog of my failures. Within a month of my return, he'd compiled a comprehensive list of everything wrong with my choices. I wasn't married. I didn't own property. I had no retirement savings to speak of. I was 30 years old and, in his estimation, starting from scratch. "Most girls your age have kids in elementary school," he said over dinner one Sunday. Mom had made pot roast, my childhood favorite, but it tasted like cardboard in my mouth. Janet's oldest just started 4th grade. She's got a real life, real responsibilities. I set down my fork carefully, the way I'd learned to control my movements under fire. "I had real responsibilities too, Dad. People's lives depended on me." He waved his hand dismissively. "That's different. That was just a job. I'm talking about building something permanent. Something that matters." The words hit like sniper fire, precise and devastating. 8 years of service reduced to just a job. 3 Bronze Stars dismissed as irrelevant work experience. I excused myself from the table and spent 20 minutes in the bathroom, staring at my reflection and practicing the same emotional control techniques that had gotten me through firefights. The criticisms came daily after that, small cuts designed to remind me of my inadequacy. When I mentioned looking for work, he suggested I might need to lower my expectations since I had no real-world experience. When I talked about using my GI Bill benefits for college, he worried I might be too set in military ways to succeed in academic settings. When I bought a used Toyota with cash saved from deployment pay, he questioned why I hadn't gotten something more practical, like a minivan for the family I didn't have. Each comment was carefully calibrated, just gentle enough to sound like concern while carrying the full weight of his disappointment. I started avoiding family dinners, finding excuses to be elsewhere when he came home from work. But Phoenix wasn't a big city, and our social circles overlapped in ways that made escape impossible. The worst part was watching other family members fall in line with his narrative. My Aunt Linda, who used to brag about her niece, the soldier, started asking pointed questions about my plans to settle down. My cousin Mike, who'd never served a day in uniform, began making jokes about military time whenever I showed up precisely when I said I would. Even my younger sister, who'd always looked up to me, started treating my service years like an extended rebellious phase I'd finally outgrown. "You know Dad just wants what's best for you," she said one afternoon while we were shopping for Mom's birthday gift. "He's worried you missed out on building a normal life while you were playing soldier." Playing soldier. The phrase stopped me cold in the middle of Macy's perfume department. I'd been shot at, bombed, mortared, and ambushed. I'd held dying soldiers and made life-or-death decisions in split seconds. I'd earned the respect of some of the toughest people in the world. But to my family, I'd been playing soldier. "Right," I said, forcing a smile. "Just playing around." By Christmas, the family dynamics had solidified into a new pattern. I was the cautionary tale, the daughter who'd taken a detour and was now scrambling to catch up to where she should have been all along. Dad had crafted a story about my military service that painted it as well-intentioned, but ultimately misguided, like joining a commune or moving to Hollywood to become an actress. It was something I'd needed to get out of my system before getting serious about life. The story gained power through repetition. At holiday gatherings, he'd mention my service in passing, then quickly pivot to more pressing concerns about my future. She did her time overseas, he'd say, but now she needs to focus on building something real. The phrase, did her time, made it sound like I'd been in prison rather than serving my country. I tried fighting back initially, correcting the narrative when I could. But arguing only seemed to prove his point about military people being rigid and confrontational. When I mentioned my Bronze Stars, he'd nod politely and change the subject to my cousin's new promotion or my sister's engagement. The medals became embarrassing artifacts of a phase I was supposed to be moving past, like punk rock albums or poetry notebooks. The psychological warfare was masterful in its subtlety. He never directly criticized my service, which would have seemed unpatriotic and unfair. Instead, he simply repositioned it as irrelevant to real life, a detour that had prevented me from achieving actual success. The message was clear. I'd wasted my 20s on something that didn't matter, and now I was behind in the only race that counted. By spring, I could feel myself beginning to believe him. When job interviews didn't lead to offers, I wondered if he was right about my military experience being irrelevant. When dates didn't lead to relationships, I questioned whether I'd missed some crucial developmental window. When I lay awake at night in my childhood bedroom, listening to the suburban silence that felt more dangerous than Kandahar ever had, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake by choosing service over the conventional path. The doubt crept in like blood poisoning, slow and systemic. Maybe I was fooling myself about the value of what I'd done. Maybe leadership in combat didn't translate to anything useful in the civilian world. Maybe the Bronze Stars were just participation trophies for showing up to a conflict that didn't matter to anyone back home. Maybe Dad was right, and I really was just a woman in her 30s with no real accomplishments, no real prospects, and no real understanding of what actually mattered in life. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in July, during what should have been an ordinary conversation about finances. I'd been living with my parents for 8 months, paying modest rent while I looked for work and figured out my next steps. The job search had been brutal. My military experience impressed exactly no one in the civilian sector, where leadership under pressure translated to probably can't adapt to office culture, and experience with high-stakes decision-making might be too intense for collaborative environments. I was at the kitchen table with my laptop, reviewing my resume for the 100th time, when Dad came in from his Tuesday golf game. He poured himself a glass of iced tea and glanced over my shoulder at the screen. "Still applying for those same jobs?" he asked. "Maybe you should consider something more entry-level. Get your foot in the door somewhere." I'd been applying for entry-level positions for months. Administrative assistant roles, customer service positions, retail management training programs. Anything that might value my experience organizing people and resources under pressure. The responses had been uniformly discouraging. Overqualified for some positions, underqualified for others, wrong cultural fit for most. "I'm qualified for better positions than entry-level," I said, not looking up from my screen. He sat down across from me, his golf shoes still on, leaving small divots of grass on Mom's clean floor. "Qualified how? You've never worked in an office. You don't know how business really operates. 8 years following orders doesn't prepare you for civilian leadership." The words hung in the air like smoke from an IED blast. Following orders. As if I'd spent 8 years saluting and marching in formation instead of making complex decisions that kept people alive. I didn't just follow orders, Dad. I gave them. I led soldiers through combat operations. I coordinated with local officials and international allies. I managed budgets and logistics and personnel. He leaned back in his chair, the patient expression he wore when explaining basic concepts to children. "That's all well and good, sweetheart, but that's military. This is the real world. Different skill set entirely. The real world." As if Afghanistan had been some kind of elaborate fantasy, as if the bullets had been made of Nerf foam and the consequences of my decisions had been limited to hurt feelings instead of lost lives. I closed my laptop carefully, the way I'd learned to handle explosives. What exactly do you think I did over there? I think you followed a very rigid structure in an artificial environment with artificial rules, he said. And now you need to learn how things actually work in civilian life, where success isn't handed to you just for showing up. Success handed to me. 3 bronze stars awarded for courage under fire, dismissed as participation trophies. 8 years of leadership in life-or-death situations, reduced to following orders in an artificial environment. I felt something crucial break inside me, like a load-bearing wall finally giving way under too much pressure. You think bronze stars are handed out for showing up? I asked quietly. He shrugged, already losing interest in the conversation. Military decorations are fine, honey, but they don't pay the bills. You need to focus on building real marketable skills. That night, I called my old squad leader, Maria Santos, who'd transitioned out 2 years earlier and was now managing a logistics company in San Diego. I needed to hear from someone who understood what our service had actually meant, what we'd actually accomplished. Your dad said what? Maria's voice was sharp with disbelief. Jesus Christ, you earned those bronze stars by keeping people alive under fire. That's not following orders, that's making decisions most people couldn't handle in a million years. I know, I said, though I was beginning to question what I knew. But maybe he's right that it doesn't translate. Maybe civilian employers don't see it the same way. Bullshit, Maria said. I use skills from our deployments every single day. Crisis management, resource allocation, personnel leadership under stress. The problem isn't your qualifications. The problem is that most civilian employers don't know how to evaluate military experience. We talked for 2 hours, and by the end of the call, I felt marginally more human. But the damage was already spreading. Dad's narrative about my service was becoming my internal monologue, the voice that whispered doubts during job interviews and questioned my worth during sleepless nights. The psychological erosion was subtle but relentless. When I mentioned possible career moves, he'd respond with gentle skepticism about whether I was being realistic. When I talked about relocating for better opportunities, he'd wonder aloud whether I was just running away from problems instead of addressing them. When I expressed frustration with the job search, he'd suggest that maybe I needed to adjust my expectations rather than blame the market. Each conversation left me feeling smaller, less certain of my own abilities. The confident leader who'd coordinated complex operations under enemy fire was slowly disappearing, replaced by a woman who second-guessed every decision and questioned every instinct. I'd survived IED blasts and firefights, but I was being systematically dismantled by a man who'd never faced anything more dangerous than a difficult customer at his insurance office. By August, I'd stopped mentioning my military service in casual conversations. It was easier to let people assume I was a late starter, someone who'd taken time to find her direction, rather than explain awards and achievements that apparently meant nothing in the real world. The bronze stars went deeper into the drawer, wrapped in tissue paper like evidence of a crime I was trying to forget. The worst part was that I could feel myself beginning to see him as right and myself as delusional. Maybe I had been living in an artificial world where different rules applied. Maybe real success meant mortgages and marriage and climbing corporate ladders in ways I'd never learned. Maybe the respect I'd earned from fellow soldiers was worthless currency in the only economy that mattered. The legal trouble started with something that should have been simple: settling my grandmother's estate. She'd passed the previous winter, leaving behind a small house in Tucson and enough savings to matter, but not enough to avoid complications. The will was straightforward, splitting everything equally between her 3 grandchildren, myself, my brother David, and my sister Michelle. But simple things rarely stay simple when family money is involved. David had always been the golden child, the one who'd followed the prescribed path of college, marriage, and corporate success. He worked in pharmaceutical sales, drove a BMW, and lived in a subdivision where every house looked like a minor variation on the same theme. Michelle had chosen the traditional route as well, marrying her high school boyfriend and producing 2 children who served as evidence of her successful launch into proper adulthood. I was the outlier, the one who'd chosen service over security, sacrifice over stability. And apparently, that made me the weak link in the inheritance chain. The first sign of trouble came during our initial meeting with the lawyer, a soft-spoken man named Henderson who handled routine estate work from an office that smelled like old leather and disappointment. David brought his wife Jennifer, a sharp-faced woman who worked in real estate. Michelle came with her husband Tom, who nodded along with whatever the last person had said. I came alone. The distribution is straightforward, Henderson explained, adjusting his reading glasses. 1/3 shares of all assets, with the house to be sold and proceeds divided equally. Actually, David said, we need to discuss whether equal distribution makes sense in this case. I felt the first whisper of alarm, like hearing incoming artillery in the distance. What do you mean? Jennifer leaned forward, her manicured nails clicking against the conference table. We're concerned about your ability to handle your share responsibly, given your current circumstances. My current circumstances. Living with my parents while job hunting, surviving on savings from my deployment pay. Apparently, being between careers at 30 qualified as financial incompetence. I'm managing my finances just fine, I said carefully. Are you? David's voice carried the same patronizing tone Dad used when explaining why my military experience didn't count as real-world preparation. You've been unemployed for almost a year. You have no steady income, no permanent address, no long-term financial planning. Michelle nodded along, her husband following suit like a dashboard bobblehead. Maybe it would be better if David and I handled the estate management. You could get your share gradually as you get back on your feet. Gradual distribution. A trust fund arrangement where my siblings would decide when I was responsible enough to access my own inheritance. The humiliation burned like white phosphorus, slow and deep and impossible to extinguish. Grandmother left that money to me directly, I said. Not to be managed by committee. Of course, Jennifer said with a smile that belonged on a snake. But we're family. We want to protect you from making impulsive decisions while you're still figuring out your direction. Impulsive decisions. As if 8 years of military service had been a gambling addiction rather than a deliberate choice to serve something larger than myself. As if my bronze stars were evidence of recklessness rather than calculated courage under fire. The meeting ended without resolution, but the damage was done. My own siblings had decided I was too unstable, too irresponsible, too fundamentally flawed to be trusted with my inheritance. They were prepared to fight me in court to protect me from myself. Within a week, David had filed a motion requesting supervised distribution of my portion of the estate. The legal paperwork used clinical language to describe my unfitness, prolonged unemployment, lack of permanent residence, absence of demonstrable financial stability. Reading those words felt like being diagnosed with a terminal disease by people who'd never gone to medical school. The preliminary hearing was set for September, giving me time to find legal representation and prepare my defense. I hired Sarah Kim, a former JAG officer who understood military service in ways civilian lawyers couldn't. She was direct, competent, and expensive enough to consume most of my remaining savings. They're betting you'll fold rather than fight, Sarah explained during our first meeting. Estate disputes are costly and time-consuming. They think you'll accept their terms rather than risk losing everything in legal fees. They were almost right. The smart financial decision would have been to accept partial distribution and maintain family relationships. But this wasn't about money anymore. It was about whether I was the capable leader who'd earned bronze stars or the irresponsible deadbeat my family believed me to be. The weeks leading up to the hearing became a sustained campaign of psychological warfare. David called regularly with updates on legal proceedings, each conversation designed to remind me of the mounting costs and uncertain outcomes. This could drag on for months, he'd say. Wouldn't it be easier to work something out between us? Michelle took a different approach, playing the concerned sister who just wanted to protect me from making a mistake that would destroy our family relationships. People are talking, she'd warn. Everyone knows about the lawsuit now. Is this really how you want to be remembered? Even Mom got involved, suggesting gently that maybe the boys had a point about responsible financial management. They're not trying to hurt you, sweetheart. They're trying to help. The implication was clear. If I fought this, I'd be proving their point about my poor judgment. Dad remained officially neutral, but his silence spoke volumes. When I asked for his support, he shrugged and said it was between his kids. When David or Michelle called him for advice, I'd hear him talking in low, serious tones about responsibility and family unity. His neutrality felt like betrayal, another confirmation that he saw me as the problem child who couldn't be trusted with adult responsibilities. The pressure was constant and coordinated, designed to wear down my resolve through attrition. Every family gathering became an opportunity for someone to mention the case, to wonder aloud why I was being so stubborn, to suggest that maybe I should consider what was best for everyone instead of just thinking about myself. I started avoiding family events, but that only provided more evidence of my instability. "She's isolating herself," I heard Michelle tell Mom. "That's not healthy behavior." By October, I was fighting on multiple fronts: the legal case, the family pressure, and my own growing doubts about whether I was making a terrible mistake. The woman who'd coordinated complex military operations was struggling to handle a simple estate dispute. Maybe they were right. Maybe I really was too damaged, too unstable, too fundamentally broken to function in the civilian world. That day in court didn't just clear my name, it forced me to stop chasing approval from people who were never going to give it. My worth was never theirs to define. What about you? Have you ever had to stand up to family when they tried to tear you down? Have you been underestimated or labeled unfairly by someone close? And if so, how did you handle it? Drop your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that their value isn't decided by anyone else.